On my birthday, my uncle stood up from the table, pointed at me, and said, "You're not part of this family." The laughter and clinking of glasses froze midair. My fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate with a dull sound. For a heartbeat, I thought I had misheard him, but the silence that followed was heavier than his words. Every face at that long, polished table was turned toward me, some cold, some almost satisfied, and a few looking down, as if the porcelain patterns on their plates were suddenly fascinating. I searched for my mother's eyes, desperate for her to shake her head, to say, "No, that's not true." But she wouldn't meet my gaze. My chest tightened, my throat closed. Not part of this family? The words echoed inside me like a bell tolling the end of something sacred. The occasion was supposed to be a celebration. Candles, flowers, the warm glow of the chandelier, the smell of roasted chicken and cinnamon pie. But in an instant, it turned into a courtroom without a judge, where the verdict had already been decided. My cousin smirked faintly, as though this moment had been rehearsed. My aunt's hand rested on his, in quiet approval. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my voice wouldn't come. My uncle's eyes didn't flinch, his jaw set like stone. "It's time you knew the truth," he said, his tone almost ceremonial, as if reading from some hidden decree. The truth. The word sliced through me, because deep down, some part of me had always feared there was one. A truth they all shared, a truth I had been kept from. And now, here it was, wrapped in the coldest birthday gift anyone could give. Exile from the only home I had ever known. When I finally found my voice, it was trembling. "Why are you saying this?" My question hung in the air, unanswered. My younger brother shifted in his chair, avoiding my eyes, and I saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped his fork. No one told me I should leave, but the unspoken command was loud enough. My appetite was gone, my heart pounding so violently I thought it would break through my ribs. I rose from the table, my chair scraping the floor, and walked away without another word. Behind me, the conversation didn't resume right away. Only when I reached the hallway did I hear the muted hum of voices again, low, conspiratorial, like they were relieved to have driven me out. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the moment over and over, the pointing finger, the stares, the absence of anyone who would stand up for me. It was more than rejection. It was a declaration of war, and I didn't yet know why they had chosen this day, this way, to deliver the first blow. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please, write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring you more powerful stories every day. All right, let's continue. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dining table again, the faces, the pointing finger, the quiet agreement in their silence. But soon those images began to blur and twist into memories from years ago. Moments I had once believed were unshakable proof that I belonged here, that I was one of them. Now, every single one of them felt tainted, painted over with the same cruel words. "You're not part of this family." I remembered being 6 years old, clutching my father's hand on my first day of school. The air was crisp, my shoes too new, and my heart pounding with the fear of walking into a room full of strangers. He had squeezed my hand and bent down so his face was level with mine. "You belong here, Emily. Always remember that." Those words had been my anchor, the thing I returned to whenever I felt small or out of place. Now I wondered, had he said them because he already knew the day would come when someone else would try to take that belonging away? I saw my mother again, not the one who had looked away from me tonight, but the one from my childhood, sitting at the edge of my bed, brushing my hair in long, slow strokes before kissing my forehead goodnight. She used to hum softly, a tune I never knew the name of, but it felt like safety. It felt like home. I had believed that her love was permanent, stitched into the fabric of my life. But now I didn't know if she had been sewing me in, or quietly unpicking the seams all along. The birthday parties in the backyard, with balloons swaying in the wind, the smell of grilled corn, and the sound of my cousins chasing each other through the grass. They used to be my happiest memories, Now, as they replayed in my mind, I realized something I had never noticed before. In every photo, in every recollection, there was always some small gap between me and the rest of them. A hand not reaching for mine, a space at the table that felt just slightly apart, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. And then came the memory that hurt the most, the night my father died. The house had been full of whispers and closed doors, but when they finally told me, my aunt had been the one to speak. I remembered her tone. Gentle, almost rehearsed. I had thought it was compassion. Now I wondered if it had been calculation. Lying there in the dark, I felt as though I had been walking my whole life on a bridge I believed was solid, only to realize it had been made of glass, and tonight they had finally struck it with a hammer. Everything beneath me was splintering. I pressed my hands over my face, but it didn't stop the flood of questions. Had they always seen me as an outsider? Was my entire childhood a well-crafted performance to keep me from asking questions until it was too late? The betrayal burned hotter than the pain. They hadn't just pushed me out of the present. They had stolen the truth about my past. Somewhere deep inside, though, under the ache and the confusion, something began to stir. A thread of defiance, faint but unbreakable. They had told me I wasn't one of them. But the life I'd lived, the memories I carried, were mine, no matter what they claimed. Still, that night, as the rain began to tap against the window, I felt the first real chill of understanding. Maybe I had never truly belonged in this family at all. The next morning I woke to a house that felt different, colder. Not in temperature, but in the way the air seemed to carry an unspoken message, like a silent verdict still echoing from the night before. I went to the kitchen hoping, foolishly, that it had all been a misunderstanding, some cruel slip of the tongue that could be taken back. But the moment I stepped through the doorway, I saw it. The same faces from the table, the same set of expressions, as if they had all been carved from the same block of stone. They moved around each other in a strange harmony, speaking in low tones that stopped abruptly whenever I came near. My cousins stood shoulder to shoulder, glancing at me without really looking, their lips twitching with something between a smirk and a dare. My aunt was making coffee, her back to me, yet I could sense the stiffness in her movements, like she was bracing herself against my presence. Even my younger brother, who had once followed me everywhere, sat at the table with his head bent over his phone, not acknowledging me at all. It hit me then, this wasn't chaos. It wasn't the fallout of an emotional outburst, it was order. It was coordination. There was a pattern to their stillness, a rhythm to their silence. The distance in their eyes wasn't born overnight. It had been growing in the shadows, nurtured like some poisonous vine, until it was strong enough to choke me out completely. I realized I had been living among actors. Every laugh we'd shared, every holiday toast, every word of kindness, those had been lines in a carefully rehearsed play. And now the script had changed, and I was the villain everyone had agreed to turn against. They didn't need to talk about it openly anymore. The decision had already been made, the roles assigned. There were glances between them that lasted just a second too long, glances I had never noticed before. An eyebrow raised here, a barely perceptible nod there. The kind of silent language you only develop when you've been keeping the same secret for a long time. And I was certain now they had been preparing for this moment. That knowledge was a wound deeper than any insult. It meant that while I was laughing with them, while I was making coffee for my uncle on Sunday mornings, or braiding my cousin's hair before a wedding, they had already decided I was not one of them. I had been excluded long before they found the courage or the cruelty to say it aloud. I stood there, my hands trembling, pretending to look for something in the cupboard so they wouldn't see how much it hurt. But in truth, I was studying them the way you study an enemy line, counting their numbers, reading their signals, trying to understand the extent of the war I hadn't known I was fighting. It was in that moment I understood. Their unity wasn't born from love for each other. It was born from their shared need to erase me. And nothing in the world is stronger than a group of people bound together by the same cruelty. That was when I knew this wasn't just a rift. This was an execution, and every single one of them had agreed to hold the blade. It happened in the living room that afternoon, with the curtains drawn so tightly that the daylight barely crept in. They had all gathered there, uncles, aunts, cousins, arranged in a semicircle that felt more like a tribunal than a family meeting. My mother sat in the middle, her posture rigid, hands clasped together in her lap. I wanted to believe she had been forced into this, but the absence of protest in her eyes told me otherwise. The words came not from her, but from my eldest uncle, his voice measured, deliberate, and cold. He spoke of family rules, as if reciting from some ancient, unbreakable law, rules I had never heard of, rules that, according to him, determined who was entitled to carry the family name, to live under this roof, to inherit what generations had built. And by those rules I did not qualify. It was said with such precision, such detachment, that for a moment it didn't even sound personal. It sounded like procedure, a verdict, final and beyond appeal. But then he added, almost casually, that this meant I had no claim to the house I grew up in, to the land where my father's ashes had been scattered, to any heirlooms that had passed through our bloodline for decades. No claim even to the name I had carried all my life. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. I felt something inside me collapse, like a structure that had been standing for years but had secretly rotted from within. My entire identity, every childhood moment, every memory tied to this family, was being stripped from me as if it were just a matter of paperwork. They weren't just pushing me out of their present. They were reaching back into my past, cutting me out of photographs, silencing my place in the stories they would tell to future generations. I thought of my father's watch, the one he used to let me wear when I was little because it made me feel grown up. Of the embroidered quilt my grandmother had sewn by hand for me when I was born. Of the family Bible that had my name inked beside my baptism date. Now I saw them all through a haze, not as cherished possessions, but as things I would never touch again. The silence after his declaration was worse than the words themselves. It was the silence of people who had already decided this long ago, who had been waiting for the right moment to cut the last thread. I scanned the room, looking for one face, just one, that might show doubt or hesitation, but every expression was the same, calm, resolved, almost relieved. I wanted to scream, to demand proof of these so-called rules, to tell them that no tradition could override the years I had spent loving them, believing I belonged. But I could feel the futility of it pressing down on me. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for my disappearance. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, as though they no longer trusted the ground in this house. I walked out without a word, but I knew this was not the end. This was only the first attempt to erase me. And somewhere deep in my chest, past the pain and disbelief, a stubborn fire began to burn. If they wanted to wipe me from their history, they were going to have to fight harder. The house was silent when I returned, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the hollow, echoing quiet of a place that no longer wanted me. The door, always heavy and slow to close, swung shut behind me with an almost eager finality, the latch clicking like a whisper, "This is the last time." I stood in the narrow hallway, my eyes drawn to the long strip of family photographs that had lined this wall for as long as I could remember. Weddings framed in gold, sunlit picnics, birthday parties with cake-smeared faces. My own image was scattered among them, laughing, hugging, holding hands with people who now wouldn't even look me in the eye. Each smile felt like a betrayal in retrospect, a record of a lie I had lived without knowing it. I reached out, my fingers brushing over the glass of one frame. My smile stared back at me, but I no longer recognized the girl inside it. One by one I took them down. The nails scratched faintly against the wall as I worked, the sound oddly intimate, like the tearing of fabric. The spaces left behind were pale rectangles surrounded by darker paint, marks of where the past had once been proudly displayed. The wall looked wounded now, exposed as though the life it had carried was being erased in real time. I carried the photos into the living room, stacking them carefully inside the cardboard box I'd brought. My movements were slow, deliberate. I wanted to believe I was rescuing these pieces of myself, but deep down I knew they were already tainted. Artifacts from a history the family had already rewritten, without me in it. Upstairs, my bedroom was exactly as I had left it. and yet it felt like a stranger's space. The curtains I'd chosen as a teenager, the soft dent in the mattress from where I used to curl up reading, the little ceramic lamp on my nightstand, all of it seemed to belong to another lifetime. I went to the bed and lifted the quilt my grandmother had made for me. The stitches were uneven in places. She'd told me it was because she refused to use a machine. A gift should carry the warmth of the hands that made it. I pressed it to my face, and for a moment the smell of cedar and lavender brought back her laugh. Then I remembered the look in my aunt's eyes earlier that day, and the memory soured. As I pulled my books from the shelf, I heard it, a faint murmur outside my door. Two voices, familiar, the kind of voices that had once called me for dinner or asked if I needed help with homework. Now they carried a new edge, sharpened and cutting. She brought this on herself. The words slid under the door and into my chest like a blade. I froze, gripping a book so tightly my knuckles whitened. I wanted to fling the door open, to demand they say it to my face, but what would be the point? Their minds had been made up long before tonight. The whispers faded, replaced by footsteps moving down the hall. I stayed still until I was sure they were gone, then continued packing, carefully, almost ceremonially. The kitchen was next. The smell of coffee grounds still lingered, the same smell that used to greet me on Sunday mornings when my uncle read the paper, and I sat across from him eating toast. The table where I had once spent hours kneading dough with my mother now looked alien, its surface too clean, too empty. I opened drawers searching for things that were mine, but most of what I touched felt claimed by someone else's hands, someone else's story. The den was harder. My father had taught me to play chess here, the two of us sitting cross-legged on the rug, him feigning defeat so I could feel the rush of winning. I could almost hear his voice explaining strategy, telling me, "You can't always win by being gentle." The lesson had seemed about chess then. Now I wondered if it had been about life. Room by room, the house seemed to push me along, as if eager to rid itself of my presence. Even the light felt different, colder, more distant. By the time I stood in the living room again, the box in my arms was nearly full. My belongings fit too easily into its small space, as though the years I had spent here had amounted to almost nothing at all. I took one last look around. The sofa where I had fallen asleep during movie nights. The small crack in the wall my father never fixed because he said it gave the place character. The scent of wood polish mixed with the faint, sweet trace of the cinnamon my mother used in her baking. Every detail felt loaded with a finality that crushed me and hardened me at the same time. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and damp, the kind that makes your skin prickle. I didn't look back as I closed the door, but I heard it, an audible, solid click. It sounded less like a door closing and more like the seal on a tomb. Whatever life I'd had inside was over. The house had belonged to me once. Now, it belonged entirely to them, and I was just another shadow passing by on the street. I set the box down in my small, dimly lit apartment, my arms aching from carrying it all the way from the house. The air here smelled faintly of the rain outside and old wood, but it felt safer than that vast, hostile place I had just left behind. I sat on the floor, cross-legged, and began unpacking, more to distract myself than for any real order. One by one, I pulled out fragments of my old life, frames with my smiling face trapped behind glass, a few books with worn spines, the quilt folded neatly on top. At the very bottom, under a pile of photo albums, my fingers brushed against something small and solid. I pulled it out slowly. A weathered leather case, cracked along the edges, the kind my father used to keep his personal things in. I hadn't seen it in years. The sight of it made my throat tighten instantly. My father's belongings had been scattered, absorbed into the house after he passed, and I had long assumed most of them had been claimed by others. Yet somehow this one had made its way into my box, maybe by mistake, maybe because someone hadn't noticed it at the bottom of a drawer. The leather was warm from my hands, and as I held it I heard his voice in my memory, deep, calm, steady. Everything we have belongs to you just as much as it belongs to the rest of us. It was something he'd told me when I was 12, after I had accidentally broken an old porcelain vase. I had been crying, terrified my mother would be angry. But he had only smiled and said those words. Back then I thought he meant it as comfort, a way of saying we're family, you're safe here. But now those words felt different. He hadn't said everything I have. He'd said everything we have. I ran my fingers over the brass clasp and opened the case. Inside, there were a few items. A pocket watch with a faint scratch across its face, a fountain pen with his initials engraved, and a bundle of folded letters tied together with a faded ribbon. My hands trembled as I untied the knot. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting unmistakably his, sharp, confident strokes. Most of the letters were simple notes, small reminders to himself. But at the very bottom, there was one sealed envelope with my name on it. The sight of it sent a shiver through me. The handwriting was precise, the ink slightly smudged in places as if he had hesitated while writing. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it, my breath uneven. For a moment I was afraid that whatever was inside would confirm everything the family had said, or worse, reveal something I wasn't prepared to know. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside was a short letter, no more than a few sentences. It spoke of documents kept in the family's possession, and told me that if I ever doubted my place, I should find them. He didn't say what they were or where exactly to look, but he made it clear that they would prove the truth. And at the bottom, in his familiar hand, he wrote, "When the time comes, don't let them take from you what is already yours." The words lit something inside me, something fierce and unyielding. My father had known. He had known they might turn on me one day. He had left me a breadcrumb trail, trusting I would be strong enough to follow it. I closed the case and held it to my chest, my pulse quickening. For the first time since the night of my birthday, the heaviness in my body began to shift. Beneath the grief and the loss, there was now a thread of purpose pulling me forward. I didn't know exactly what I would find, but I knew this much. They had underestimated me. Somewhere in that house, buried under layers of dust and lies, was proof that I belonged. And I was going to find it. The rain had stopped by nightfall, but the streets outside my window still glistened under the glow of the street lamps. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the contents of my father's leather case, the letter with his warning lying in front of me like a map without landmarks. I read it again and again, hoping the ink might reveal more if I stared long enough. The words about documents kept in the family's possession echoed through my mind, each repetition sinking deeper, making the room feel smaller, heavier. I dug back into the box, shifting through the rest of my belongings with a strange desperation, as if something else might be hiding there, waiting to be found. At the very bottom, tucked between two old yearbooks, I found it, a small battered cardboard box with my father's handwriting scrawled across the top. The ink was faded, the letters almost illegible, but I recognized his hand instantly. My name wasn't on it. Instead, in bold strokes, it simply read, "For when she needs the truth." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a mess of papers, receipts, scraps of notes, photographs curling at the edges. Beneath them, I found a second envelope, this one sealed so tightly I had to slide a knife under the flap to break it open. The paper inside was thin. The handwriting rushed, uneven, as though it had been written in great urgency. "Emily," it began, "if you are reading this, it means they've turned against you. I wish I could be there to stop it, but I can't. You must know there are documents, our founding documents, kept in the family archive. They prove your rightful place, and more than that, they prove why they fear you having it. They will tell you they are gone. They will tell you they never existed. Don't believe them." I had to stop reading for a moment. My breath came too fast, my hands cold despite the warm air in the room. I read the next lines slowly, my eyes moving over every word like they were pieces of a code. "The documents are kept in the locked cabinet in the library. You know the one. I never gave them the spare key. It's hidden in the place only you and I knew about, the hollow behind the wooden panel in the upstairs hallway. Go at night. Do not let them see you." The words carried his voice so vividly that for a second it was as if he were in the room with me, his hand on my shoulder, urging me to move. But then the weight of what I had read settled in. The library, the locked cabinet, the hollow panel in the upstairs hallway. I could see each place clearly in my mind, their details carved into my memory from years of living there. And I could also see the barriers, faces that would never allow me to set foot in that house again. They had already erased me in the daylight. The only way back in would be in the dark. I placed the letter gently on the floor beside me, but my mind was racing. My father had hidden the key for me, trusting that one day I might need it. He had known they would try to take everything. He had known this war was coming, even if I hadn't. As I sat there, the apartment around me faded from view. All I could see was the house at night, its windows dark, the old floorboards creaking under careful steps, the air heavy with the risk of being caught. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but there was no turning back. If those documents were still there, they were the last thread between me and the truth. Without them, I would be exactly what they said I was, no one. With them, I could prove everything, and so for the first time since they had cast me out, I felt something sharper than grief. I felt resolve. I was going back. The next evening, I walked the familiar road to the house, my father's letter folded tightly in my pocket like a talisman. The air was cool, and the faint scent of damp earth clung to everything after the rain. I had told myself I would go at night, unseen, but something in me couldn't wait. I needed to look at the place, to feel its walls close enough to touch. Maybe I thought I could slip in unnoticed, retrieve what was mine before anyone realized. But as I rounded the bend and the house came into view, I knew that hope was naive. The lights inside were already on, glowing through the curtains like watchful eyes. The driveway was crowded with cars, the kind of unspoken sign that a family gathering was underway. My chest tightened, but I kept walking, my steps slow, deliberate. The closer I came, the more I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. Birthdays, summers, nights on the porch, memories that had once been warm but now seemed to belong to someone else. I climbed the front steps, my hand instinctively reaching for the brass doorknob, the one I had turned thousands of times without a thought. But before I could touch it, the door swung open. He was standing there, my cousin Daniel. We had been inseparable as children, building forts in the attic, whispering secrets under blankets during storms. Now his eyes were hard, his mouth curved in a smirk that cut deeper than any insult. He didn't move to let me in. "You can't be here," he said, his voice low but laced with satisfaction. The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of everyone inside. I stood frozen, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I had every right to be here, that I belonged more than any of them. But my throat felt like it was closing. My mind raced with the image of the locked cabinet in the library, of my father's handwriting, urging me not to let them take what was mine. That image clashed violently with the reality of the door now serving as a barrier, the man I'd once called my closest friend, guarding it like a soldier. Behind him, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows passing through the hallway, voices murmuring from the dining room. I imagined them glancing toward the door, already knowing who had come, already ready to dismiss me without even standing up. The heat in my chest burned so fiercely it felt like it might tear through my ribs. Daniel's smirk deepened. "Go home, Emily," he said, and the way he lingered on my name made it sound like a mockery. He didn't slam the door in my face. He simply stood there until I stepped back, as if waiting for me to acknowledge his power in this moment. I took one last look past him, into the hallway where my father used to greet me with open arms, where the smell of my mother's cooking used to wrap around me the moment I stepped inside. Now it was just a corridor of shadows, guarded and unreachable. When I turned away, my feet felt heavy, my heart beat loud in my ears. I walked back down the steps, the night air biting against my skin, and the sound of the door closing behind me was soft but final. Not a slam, just a quiet, deliberate closure, as though the house itself was agreeing with him. As I walked away, the anger inside me didn't fade. It grew, curling tighter, becoming something sharper. They could bar the door tonight, but I would come back. Not as a beggar asking for entry, but as someone ready to take what was hers. The street was deserted when I returned, long after midnight, the air so still that even the leaves seemed to be holding their breath. The house stood in the darkness like a silent fortress, its windows black, its walls heavy with the weight of everything that had happened inside. I stayed in the shadows for a long time, watching, waiting for any flicker of movement behind the curtains. Nothing. The silence was complete, but it didn't comfort me. It only made the risk feel sharper, like a blade against my skin. I crept across the lawn, the damp grass cold under my shoes. Every step felt like an intrusion, each crunch of gravel underfoot sending a jolt through me, as though the sound alone could summon them. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that if I was caught, they wouldn't just turn me away. They would know exactly why I was here. The front door was impossible, too exposed, too easy for them to hear. Instead, I circled to the back, where the old kitchen door still had the warped frame my father always meant to fix. It had been my secret entryway as a teenager, when I'd sneak back in after staying out too late. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The wood groaned quietly as I pushed it open, and the smell of the house rushed over me. Old wood, faint traces of lemon polish, and something else I couldn't name. Inside, the darkness was thick, the kind that seems to muffle even your own breathing. I waited for my eyes to adjust, my ears straining for any sound, a creak upstairs, the shifting of someone in bed. All I heard was the slow, steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I moved carefully, my shoes brushing the floor in silence. The walls around me felt closer than I remembered, as if the house had shrunk in my absence, wrapping itself tighter around its secrets. Every familiar object seemed strange now. The coat rack by the door, the worn rug in the hall. This wasn't my home anymore. It was enemy territory. The library was on the far side of the house, past the staircase that led up to the hallway where my father's hiding place was. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, my hand resting on the banister worn smooth by years of use. It was here that the danger doubled. One wrong step and the floorboards would betray me. One flick of a light upstairs, and I would be caught. The climb was slow, my breath shallow, my body tensed for the smallest sound. Halfway up, I froze. Was that movement above me? My heart slammed against my ribs as I listened. Nothing. Just the faint settling of the house. I forced myself to keep going. The upstairs hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by the thin silver light slipping in through a crack in the curtains. My eyes found it immediately, the panel my father had shown me once when I was little, in a moment that had seemed like a game back then. "It's our secret," he'd whispered, smiling. Now it felt less like a game and more like a lifeline. I knelt and slid my fingers along the wood, searching for the spot where the panel loosened. My palms were slick, my breath too loud in my own ears. There, a slight give under my touch. I pulled it back slowly, the wood protesting with a soft creak, and reached inside. My fingers brushed something small and cold, a key. I closed my hand around it, my pulse surging. This was it, the first step. The locked cabinet in the library was no longer beyond my reach. I pushed the panel back into place and rose, clutching the key so tightly it dug into my palm. But as I turned toward the stairs, the air in the hallway shifted and I froze. Somewhere below, a floorboard creaked. I didn't breathe as I crept down the stairs, each step measured, my weight shifting slowly so the wood wouldn't groan beneath me. The key in my fist felt impossibly heavy now, as though it carried not just metal, but the burden of my father's trust. The faint creak I had heard upstairs lingered in my mind like a warning, but the silence that followed was complete. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, but my body stayed tense, ready to flee if I had to. The library door was closed. In the dim light from the hall, the polished wood gleamed like a dark mirror, reflecting a shadowy version of me. I turned the handle slowly and slipped inside, pulling the door almost shut behind me. The room smelled exactly as I remembered, old leather, dust, and the faint, dry scent of aged paper. In the far corner stood the cabinet, tall and narrow, its brass lock glinting faintly. My hands shook as I slid the key into place. For a moment, I feared it wouldn't turn, that the lock had been changed, that this entire mission had been for nothing. But then, with a soft click, it gave way. I pulled the door open, and a breath of stale air rushed out. the scent of paper that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were shelves stacked with folders and boxes, their labels written in my grandfather's tidy, looping script. At the very bottom, pushed into the corner as if forgotten, sat a small, dust-covered trunk, the kind you might see in an attic, holding keepsakes from another lifetime. My pulse quickened. I knelt and dragged it out. Dust rose in a cloud, making me cough softly, and my fingers left clean streaks on the lid as I brushed it off. The metal latch was stiff, resisting for a moment before snapping open. The hinges groaned as I lifted the lid, and the smell hit me immediately. Old paper, dry ink, the faint tang of wax seals. Inside were stacks of documents, their pages yellowed, edges curled with age. Some were bound with ribbon, others stamped with the family crest I hadn't seen since my father's funeral. I lifted the top bundle carefully, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded, but still legible. Dates from over a century ago marched across the top, followed by dense paragraphs that looked more like legal decrees than letters. I flipped through page after page, my eyes catching phrases that made my chest tighten. Equal inheritance rights, unbroken lineage, descendants named and recognized. And then, there it was, my own name, written in careful black ink, listed among the heirs with the same rights as anyone else in this family. Not a guest, not an outsider. My place here had been sealed long before I was even born. Beneath the papers were photographs, sepia portraits of ancestors, gatherings on the same lawn I had played on as a child. Some I recognized from framed pictures in the hallway, but others were new to me. They were proof of a history they had tried to bury, and it was all here, in my hands. The weight of it was almost overwhelming. This wasn't just about proving I belonged. These documents carried something else, something they clearly didn't want me to have. My father's letter had said they feared me knowing the truth. Now I understood why. This wasn't a family's petty grudge. This was about power, about control, and about something in these pages that could shift both forever. I closed the trunk slowly, my mind racing with the possibilities, the risks. But before I could decide what to take, a sound shattered the stillness. A door slammed somewhere in the house, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps in the hall outside the library. The footsteps in the hallway froze me in place. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. I crouched lower over the trunk, my hands hovering above the papers, torn between the instinct to hide and the certainty that if I left without what I had come for, I might never get another chance. I forced myself to move quickly, sifting through the stacks until I found it, a single leather-bound folder at the very bottom, heavier than the rest. Its edges were worn smooth from years of handling, but the gold embossing on the cover was still clear. Founding Charter of the Family Estate. I slipped it out and set it on the carpet, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The paper inside was thick, almost velvety to the touch, the ink a deep, faded black. The first pages were formal, filled with the sweeping language of another century, laying out the creation of the family trust, the division of lands, the names of those entitled to them. I scanned line after line until my eyes caught on something that stopped me cold. There it was, my name. Not an afterthought scribbled in later, not a conditional clause buried in the fine print. It was written in the same hand, the same ink as all the others, positioned prominently alongside those of my cousins, uncles, and aunts. And next to it, in precise legal phrasing, was a note. With full and equal rights to inheritance, including the right of final decision in matters of the estate, to be transferred directly without contest. I read it again just to be certain I hadn't imagined it. My father's voice seemed to echo inside me, the words he had said so many years ago. Everything we have belongs to you just as much as it belongs to the rest of us. Only now did I understand he hadn't been speaking in sentiment. He had been stating a fact. The realization was dizzying. They hadn't just lied to me out of cruelty. They had lied because the truth gave me power. This document didn't just confirm my place, it made it impossible for them to erase me. I was not merely an heir. I had rights they could never challenge, rights that might even outrank their own. A rush of emotions surged through me, vindication, grief, fury. Every insult, every cold stare, every calculated attempt to push me out suddenly looked different in the light of this truth. They hadn't been rejecting me because I didn't belong. They had been trying to keep me from realizing that I belonged more than any of them wanted to admit. My hands tightened around the folder. The paper smelled faintly of ink and time, the scent of something too old and too important to destroy. I knew then that if they found me here with it, they would do whatever it took to take it back. This wasn't just proof. It was the very thing they had been guarding all along. The footsteps came again, closer now, steady and unhurried. Whoever it was, they weren't searching blindly. They were coming straight toward the library. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of their steps, faster and faster until it was a drumbeat in my chest. I slid the folder into my bag, pushing it deep beneath the other papers, and closed the trunk as quietly as I could. The latch clicked softly, and in that same instant, the shadow of movement passed under the door. I didn't run, not yet. Whoever was outside the door lingered there for a moment, their shadow motionless against the thin strip of light at the threshold, and then, just as quietly, moved away. I waited until the sound of their footsteps faded into the deeper parts of the house before I let myself breathe again. My hands were damp with sweat, my grip on the leather-bound folder so tight that my fingers ached. I knew I should leave immediately, but something in me refused. This wasn't just about getting proof anymore. It was about knowing the whole truth. I knelt in the dim light of the library and opened the folder again, my eyes racing over the dense legal text, turning page after page. At first, it was all clauses and dates, the formal language of inheritance and property rights. But then I began to notice the annotations. Faint pencil marks in the margins, lines underlined with such force the paper was indented. They weren't my father's handwriting. These strokes were sharper, angrier. And then, in one of the appendices, I found it. Minutes from a private family council held just a month after my father died. The list of attendees was a roll call of the same people who had sat at that table and told me I didn't belong. The notes were brief, but the language was unmistakable. In order to preserve the stability of the estate, certain clauses of the founding charter are to be set aside from common knowledge. My name was there, not erased, but surrounded by a box, as if it were the problem itself. One line, written in darker ink, nearly stopped my heart. If she is unaware of her status, she cannot claim her rights. I stared at it until the words blurred. They had known, all of them. For years they had been meeting behind closed doors, making decisions about my life while I sat in that very house, oblivious. Every smile, every forced kindness, every word of comfort after my father's death. It had all been part of the same performance, a way to keep me close enough to monitor but far enough from the truth to be powerless. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a moment of cruelty born from anger. It was a plan, a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to strip me of everything my father had meant for me to have. My mind reeled back through every interaction since his funeral. The way certain conversations would stop when I entered the room, the way they always insisted on handling the mail, the way they locked the library when not in use, the sudden coolness in my mother's voice, the awkward glances between cousins when I asked about the family business. It all aligned now, perfectly, in a pattern I had been too blind or too trusting to see. My stomach twisted, but beneath the nausea there was something else, a cold, steady clarity. I had spent weeks thinking I was powerless, believing their narrative that I was an outsider, but these pages proved I was the threat, the rightful heir, the one person who could challenge everything they had built on lies. I traced my name on the page with my fingertip, not gently, but with the firm pressure of someone reclaiming what had been stolen. They had kept this from me because they feared exactly what was happening in this moment, that I would know, and once I knew, I would never let it go. The library seemed to grow darker, the air heavier, as if the house itself were trying to push me out now that I carried this knowledge. I slid the papers back into the folder, closed it, and pressed it to my chest. My father had hidden the key, but he had also hidden the truth inside me, trusting that one day I would find it. I was no longer here to prove my worth to them. I was here to prepare for war. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that seeps into a room reluctantly, as if it knows something unpleasant waits beyond the walls. I hadn't slept. The folder lay on the table beside me all night, its weight like an anchor, tethering me to the decision I knew I had to make. Every time my eyelids drifted shut, I saw their faces at the table, their silence sharpened into a weapon, their eyes heavy with the satisfaction of casting me out. But now I carried something they hadn't planned for. By the time I reached the house, my hands were cold despite the warmth of the morning air. Cars lined the driveway, too many for an ordinary day. They were all here. My stomach knotted, but I kept walking. My fingers locked around the worn leather of the folder. I didn't knock. I opened the door and stepped inside like I had every right to, because now I knew I did. The murmur of voices guided me to the dining room. They were seated exactly as they had been the night they exiled me. The same long table polished to a shine, the same air of ceremony. A few heads turned when I entered. Conversations died mid-sentence. My cousin Daniel's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he leaned back in his chair. My mother's eyes flickered to the folder in my hands, then away again, as if it burned her to look at it. I didn't speak right away. I walked the length of the table, the sound of my footsteps crisp in the silence, and placed the folder in the center. The thud it made seemed louder than it should have been, an announcement in itself. For a moment no one moved. The leather cover caught the light, and I saw several pairs of eyes, narrow in recognition. They knew exactly what it was. Slowly I opened it, letting the first page show. The founding charter, the elegant black ink, the list of heirs. My name. I didn't have to point to it. They could all see it. The air shifted, the weight of their stillness pressing harder, as if the entire room were holding its breath. "This," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "is the truth you've been hiding." I didn't raise my tone. I didn't need to. The words landed in the center of the table like a stone thrown into still water, and I watched the ripples spread. An uncle cleared his throat, his fingers twitching against the arm of his chair. My aunt looked down at her clasped hands. Daniel's smirk had vanished entirely now, replaced by something tighter, meaner. And my mother, she still wouldn't look at me, her jaw rigid, as if acknowledging me would make all of this real. I slid a page from the back of the folder and placed it on top, the meeting minutes from after my father's death, the line boxed around my name. If she is unaware of her status, she cannot claim her rights. My eyes locked on each of them in turn. "You knew, all of you, and you chose to pretend I didn't exist?" The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It wasn't triumphant, it was defensive. I could feel them calculating, scrambling for ways to contain what I had just unleashed. But they couldn't erase it now, not without me, and not without destroying themselves in the process. I stood there a moment longer, letting them see that I wasn't afraid to face them, that I wasn't here to ask for a place at the table. They were the ones who would have to reckon with what they'd done. And as I gathered the folder back into my arms, I realized something. For the first time since they had cast me out, the power in the room wasn't theirs. I didn't leave the house after laying the documents on the table. Instead, I stepped aside toward the doorway, and a moment later, the sound of measured footsteps filled the hall. Heads turned as a man in a dark suit entered, his briefcase in hand. The sight of him shifted the air instantly. This wasn't just a family matter anymore, this was official. "This is my legal representative," I said, my voice even. I watched the expressions around the table tighten, narrowed eyes, clenched jaws, the subtle recoil of people who suddenly understood they were no longer in control of the narrative. My lawyer set his case on the table and opened it with a quiet click, pulling out neatly stacked papers. He didn't rush. The slow precision of his movements seemed to unnerve them more than any raised voice could. When he spoke, his tone was calm but absolute, the kind of voice that leaves no room for argument. He began by reading directly from the founding charter, his finger tracing the clauses as he went. The list of heirs, the equal division of rights, and the unbreakable clause granting me not just inheritance but decision-making authority within the estate. Every word landed like a hammer, each one stripping away another layer of the false reality they had tried to build around me. Then he turned to the minutes of that private family council, the ones I had found, the the ones with my name boxed in ink. He read the line aloud, slowly. If she is unaware of her status, she cannot claim her rights. The room shifted uncomfortably, a rustle of clothes, and the creak of chairs as they avoided each other's eyes. My lawyer let the silence hang for a beat too long before continuing. "This is not only morally reprehensible," he said, "but it is in direct violation of the binding agreements laid out by your own founders. Any attempt to exclude her is null and void." The words null and void seemed to hang in the air like a blade suspended over their heads. I watched my uncle's knuckles whiten around the arm of his chair, my cousin Daniel's jaw tighten until I thought it might crack. My aunt's face drained of color, her lips pressed into a bloodless line. My mother. She sat utterly still, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles looked like bone. She still would not meet my eyes. "You should also be aware," my lawyer added, sliding another paper forward, "that continued obstruction of her rights will carry legal consequences, severe ones." His voice didn't rise, but the emphasis was enough to send a ripple through the room. No one spoke. It was as if the table itself had absorbed their voices, leaving only the sound of my lawyer's steady breathing and the faint hum of the chandelier above us. I felt the balance shift again, that subtle but undeniable pull of power, changing hands. For weeks they had made me small, silent, invisible, but now they were the ones shrinking under the weight of truth. I looked at each of them, not with triumph, but with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed their approval. I hadn't come to beg. I had come to take back what was mine, and the law was on my side. And for the first time since my father's death, I felt him with me, not as a memory, but as a presence, standing at my shoulder, watching justice take shape in the very room where they had tried to erase me. The meeting did not end in an explosion of voices or dramatic confessions. It ended in something quieter, heavier, the sound of inevitability settling over the room. My lawyer gathered the papers back into his briefcase with slow precision, leaving copies on the table for each of them. No one touched them right away. They just sat there like fragile, dangerous artifacts, proof of a truth they had worked so hard to bury. By the time the final words were spoken, the terms were clear. My name would remain exactly where it had always belonged, on the charter, in the records, in the history of this family. My rights were affirmed in writing, witnessed by someone who would ensure they could never be challenged again. On paper, I had won completely. There was nothing they could take from me now. But winning didn't feel like I thought it would. As I stood at the head of the table, looking at each face, I felt a hollowness where I had expected triumph to bloom. My uncle's eyes, once sharp with disdain, were now dull with resignation. My aunt kept her gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table as though the pattern might swallow her whole. Daniel's smirk had been replaced with something darker, a silent promise that the war between us was not over, only changed. And my mother, she sat at the far end, her hands folded neatly, her posture flawless, her eyes never once meeting mine. If there had been a part of me, even a small one, that had hoped she would break in this moment, that she would stand, cross the room, and tell me she had been wrong, it was crushed under the weight of her stillness. She hadn't lost a legal battle. She had lost a daughter, and I wasn't sure she even cared. The truth was written now in black and white, impossible to erase. But no ink on a page could rebuild what had been broken. I had my place, my name, my inheritance. What I did not have was a family, not in the way I once understood the word. I thought of my father then, of the warmth in his voice when he said, "Everything we have belongs to you just as much as it belongs to the rest of us." He had meant it, but perhaps even he had known that the rest of them never truly did. I wondered if he had foreseen this exact moment, me standing here, my hands full of the rights he had fought to protect, my heart full of the knowledge that love had never been part of their bargain. When the meeting ended, there were no handshakes, no words of acknowledgement. Chairs scraped against the floor, papers were shuffled, and one by one they left the room, their eyes avoiding mine. I watched them go, each step a reminder that the blood we shared did not bind us, not in the ways that mattered. I walked out of the house with the charter under my arm, the late afternoon light spilling across the lawn. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the roses my grandmother had planted decades ago. They were still blooming, untouched by the bitterness that had poisoned everything else here. For the first time I realized that the house, the land, the legacy, they were mine now, not because I had been given them, but because I had taken them back. It was a victory, yes, a clean, undeniable victory. But as I reached the edge of the driveway and looked back one last time, I understood something that felt heavier than any loss I had known. Justice and love are not the same. I had won my place in the family, but I would never again feel at home among them. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click, and I walked away carrying both the weight of my triumph and the hollow ache it had left behind. Some victories, I realized, taste like ashes, and yet the truth was mine now, and no one, not even them, could take it away again.